This is NBC.
NBC News produced this program and is solely responsible for its content.
The makers of Camel cigarettes bring the world's latest news events right into your own living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. The Camel News Caravan presents Today's News Today. Produced for Camel Cigarettes by NBC.
Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening to you. The revelation and the admission noted here yesterday that Senator Nixon, the Republican vice presidential candidate, was receiving what amounted to a private salary, an extra salary, from private persons in California, is becoming a major political story. Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening to you. This is John Cameron Swayze reporting the news for the biggest car of the low price 3, Plymouth.
Plymouth, the car that's making news, presents the Plymouth News Caravan. The excitement, the drama of today's news today. Produced for Plymouth by NBC.
Messages of condolence have been flooding into Princeton, New Jersey since early this morning, when the death of Albert Einstein was announced to the world.
NBC New York, this is the news, reported by Chet Huntley and David Brinkley.
The United States today honored Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Millions of people cheered the Apollo 11 astronauts in parades in New York and Chicago.
This is the NBC Nightly News, Monday, August 3rd, 1970. Brought to you by Post Cereals, the cereals that make breakfast a little bit better.
There are numerous reports here in Washington and in Southeast Asia that American airplanes in Cambodia are flying in combat in close support of Cambodian ground troops.
From Milwaukee, Wisconsin, this is NBC Nightly News, Tuesday, April 4th, reported by John Chancellor with David Brinkley's Journal.
And good evening from Milwaukee, where the voters of Wisconsin turned out today in the fourth important presidential primary of the year, and on a day when the North Vietnamese invasion of South Vietnam grew in power and gravity. We'll have a series of reports on that story, including satellite film from Vietnam.
This is NBC Nightly News, Wednesday, October 10th, reported by John Chancellor with David Brinkley's Journal.
Good evening. Spiro T. Agnew became a private citizen today, and less than 1 hour after his resignation as vice president became official, he was convicted of a criminal charge of tax evasion.
From the NBC News Center in New York, this is NBC Nightly News, Thursday, August 8th, reported by John Chancellor.
Good evening. We now begin our special, continuous, all-evening coverage of the ordeal of President Nixon.
This is NBC Nightly News, Tuesday, June 24th, with John Chancellor reporting from the NBC News Center in New York.
Good evening. More than 100 people were reported dead in a plane crash near New York's Kennedy Airport this afternoon.
This is NBC Nightly News, December 23rd, with John Chancellor reporting from the NBC News Center in New York.
Good evening. President-elect Carter finished.
This is NBC Nightly News with John Chancellor and David Brinkley, Thursday, July 14th.
New York City in the early morning after a night of no electric power, and so no lights, elevators, subway trains, or any trains, airports, air conditioning, traffic signals, television. What it did have in the dark streets was a wild outburst of crime. Arson, looting, mugging, and 1,000 false fire alarms.
This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with John Chancellor in Jerusalem, David Brinkley in Washington, and Jessica Savage in New York.
Good evening. Speaking to the Israeli parliament today, President Sadat of Egypt more or less recognized and accepted Israel.
This is NBC Nightly News with David Brinkley in Washington and John Chancellor in New York.
Good evening. There was a huge explosion in Lower Manhattan this afternoon which injured more than 100 people. At least 14 of the victims are on the critical list.
This is NBC Nightly News with David Brinkley in Washington and John Chancellor in New York.
Good evening. The worst air crash in American history took place today. An American Airlines DC-10 with 279 people aboard lost power during a takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. It plunged 2,000 feet to the ground and everyone was killed.
This is NBC Nightly News with David Brinkley, who is off tonight, John Chancellor in New York, and tonight's special segment, Labor Takes Aim at the South.
Good evening. Hurricane David, one of the deadliest storms of the century, rolled up the coast of Florida today. It missed Miami, but struck at the Gold Coast of central Florida around Palm Beach, and tonight it is chewing its way northward toward Cape Canaveral and Georgia.
From New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Jessica Savage.
Good evening. Two major news stories are converging this evening. Americans prepare to choose a president on Tuesday. And Iran, well aware of our elections, is increasing its indications that the American hostages will soon be returned. Iran's parliament is expected to meet tomorrow in its first public session on the hostages, and presumably the parliament will discuss the Ayatollah Khomeini's four-point plan for the hostages' release.
This is NBC Nightly News. Reporting from New York, Jessica Savage.
Good evening. As British reinforcements advance toward the Falkland Islands, Argentina announced it has strengthened its defensive positions.
This is NBC Nightly News, reported by Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. President Reagan moved on to South Korea tonight after sending a stiff warning to the Soviet Union from Japan today. In a Tokyo television interview, the president said if the Soviets don't agree to a nuclear arms cutback, the West will turn its industrial power to the production of military might.
This is NBC Nightly News, reported by Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. President Reagan was on the road today leading a big push for prayer in public schools. Good evening. I'm Tom Brokaw with NBC Nightly News. President Reagan's doctors say that he is doing beautifully tonight after a nearly 3-hour operation. There is no obvious sign of cancer, but there will be additional tests. And Vice President Bush still has the power of the presidency, which was transferred to him by Mr. Reagan shortly before surgery began today, to cover the time that the president would be under anesthesia and during the time of the immediate recovery. President Reagan announces South Africa sanctions and draws fire from Bishop Tutu. 2 NBC journalists die covering a failed coup in Thailand, and a New York City flare-up over kids and AIDS in school.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. President Reagan tonight is under attack from both sides of the South Africa dispute for steps that he took today. The president, who has always said that he opposes economic sanctions against South Africa, issued an executive order that amounts to limited sanctions. It's morning in the Philippines, and the polls now are open for one of the most dramatic and bitter presidential campaigns of this decade.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening from Manila, where it is now Friday morning, election day for this tiny nation in the Pacific. President Reagan tells Congress he's determined to go ahead with the Persian Gulf plan. And in the Soviet Union, another big step for Glasnost tonight.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. President Reagan and Congress tonight appear to be heading for a major showdown over his plans to go ahead with American protection for Kuwaiti oil tankers in the Persian Gulf. Robertson charges he was sandbagged by the Swaggart scandal. South Dakota and Minnesota make their choices, and there are taxing questions tonight for the IRS.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. No doubt about it, former television evangelist Pat Robertson is a major player in the race for the Republican presidential nomination, finishing second in Iowa and expecting to do well throughout the South on Super Tuesday, March 8th. The wreckage of Pan Am Flight 103 scattered across the Scottish countryside as the victims are remembered at memorial services and officials deal with troubling questions.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. By now, most of the world knows that when Pan Am Flight 103 crashed into the Scottish village of Lockerbie, a portrait of the revolution. A young Chinese stops an army tank column with nothing more than his courage and ideals.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. China tonight is a country consumed by rage, grief, chaos, and rumor. Political opponents embrace in Nicaragua, while President Bush promises a quick end to sanctions. In Moscow, Gorbachev gets what he wants, more power as Soviet president. And major legal developments in the Exxon oil spill case.
NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight from Washington.
Good evening from Washington, where I have been spending the day with President Bush, preparing for tomorrow night's NBC News special, A Day in the Life of the White House.
The forces of nature slow the forces of Desert Shield. And GIs celebrate Christmas very carefully.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Tonight, sitting in for Tom is John Cochran.
Good evening and Merry Christmas. The timetable for war in the Gulf may slip well past the UN's January 15th deadline for Iraq to pull out of Kuwait. The reason? Uncertainty about the readiness of U.S. forces.
President Bush in the White House tonight. Has he decided to go to war? In the streets of Baghdad, defiance as the UN deadline passes.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. The war can begin at any time. Bill Clinton took his case to the people today, saying the woman who claims a long love affair is a liar, which is the same charge she made against him today.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Reporting tonight from NBC News headquarters in New York.
Good evening. No one wanted this presidential campaign to get sidetracked by stories of an extramarital affair, but tonight, that's exactly what's happened as a result of allegations against Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. The Mississippi has gone mad in the Midwest. The coster is running as high as the river. Denny's strikes a deal with the NAACP, and it's not all about race. And on America Close Up tonight, is your clean air being violated? Pollution cops can help.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. When the mighty Mississippi goes on a rampage, it's a mess and very expensive. O.J. Simpson in court charged with murder.
Not guilty.
The president's health care plan, it's in critical condition on Capitol Hill. And on Health Watch tonight, life and death decisions, a plan to get you involved.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. O.J. Simpson. It's often been said that he can light up a room just with his presence.
The search for evidence in the pilot's own words just before the U.S. air disaster. How many more will make the trip, the deal between the U.S. and Cuba? and the papal trek to a land in need of healing.
From NBC News, this is NBC Nightly News, reported by Brian Williams.
Good evening. In the countryside outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania tonight, the work goes on.
On the eve of replacement player games, the season opener has been postponed and the suspense continues. A changing of the guard in Haiti as the fragile democracy continues to bleed. And battling bullets with blazers, boarding schools offer an escape from the dangers of the street.
From NBC News, this is NBC Nightly News, reported by Brian Williams. Substituting tonight is Chuck Scarborough.
Good evening. It is an agonizing evening for fans of the national pastime tonight, but there is now a sign the labor dispute may soon be over. The 1995 baseball season was to officially open tomorrow, but what was supposed to be the first game, which was to be played using replacement players, was suddenly postponed tonight, and the real start of the real season now hinges on a lockout vote by the owners.
The Senate says yes to an increase in the minimum wage, up another 90 cents to $5.15 an hour. Tough questions today for America's military brass and defense secretary on the Saudi explosion. NBC News in depth tonight, a new player in the presidential race and the future of the Reform Party.
From NBC News, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. The minimum wage is almost surely going up, probably by 90 cents an hour to $5.15 a year from now.
How much punishment is enough? How much will Mike Tyson be forced to pay for an animalistic act in the boxing ring?
Thank you for coming.
NBC News in depth tonight charges that the healthcare business had no business dragging its feet in a dying man's case. And money to burn, places to go. Guess who grandparents are bringing on vacation?
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Substituting tonight, Brian Williams.
Good evening. Most Americans who have seen the videotape of what happened in the ring in Las Vegas on Saturday night have wondered, is there something wrong with boxing or just one boxer?
After 3 days of silence, an angry President Clinton fights back.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
The president, in effect, challenges the media and the independent prosecutor. Prove it. While that woman, 24-year-old Monica Lewinsky, emerges from seclusion today with her lawyers. Intense negotiations with prosecutors to tell everything. While in Iraq, the time for talk is all but over. The president tells the Pentagon to plan to hit Saddam hard unless he opens all sites to weapons inspection.
From NBC News, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Reporting tonight from Washington.
Good evening. Tonight, that alleged White House sex scandal is beginning to resemble a high-stakes poker game.
Tale of the tape. Explosive new evidence of what happened at Waco. Who really started the fire? Making the grade. Everyone knows America's public schools need fixing. Tonight, George W. Bush's plan. Can it work? In depth tonight, troubled waters. The last big weekend of the summer. Just how safe are America's beaches? And meet the new neighbors. What happens when the first couple picks a new White House?
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Substituting tonight, Jane Pauley.
Good evening. Tonight, President Clinton says he is deeply concerned and wants a new independent investigation of what happened that fateful day 6 years ago in Waco, Texas.
Day of crisis, a devastating terrorist attack on a U.S. destroyer in the Middle East. American sailors dead, wounded, and missing.
We will find out who was responsible and hold them accountable.
The manhunt tonight. How will America respond? Shockwaves on Wall Street. Stocks plunge almost 400 points. How low will it go? And in depth, the Truth Squad, Bush, Gore, and today's fight over the facts.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. This has been a day of sudden and unexpected crises, tragic and maddening, and far from resolved tonight.
Sinking feeling, the market slumping, jobs disappearing, 401ks taking a beating. What you need to know to safeguard your retirement. And Lifeline, women beating the biological clock, unlocking the timetable for menopause. The answer could be all in your genes.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Substituting tonight, Stone Phillips.
Good evening. More distress signals tonight about the U.S. economy. The Bush tax break may be putting more money in people's pockets, but that's right where it's staying.
Attack on America. The day after, the smoke begins to clear. A breakthrough. NBC's terrorism task force with new information on who did this and why. The president's press secretary says the White House and Air Force One were missed targets. A day of desperate rescues, profound sadness, and moments of astonishing kindness.
Attack on America. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. Tonight, another major section of New York City's World Trade Center is in danger of collapsing as the United States is marshaling forces for a war against terrorism. Presidential fitness, a health scare for the president after he chokes and falls unconscious. What happened? How serious was it? Where was the Secret Service? And royal trouble, Britain's Prince Harry. Allegations of drug and alcohol use, his father's tough love solution.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. President George Bush spent most of the day laughing it off. His doctors say he's in good health and there should be no long-term consequences. Road to war? UN weapons inspectors say Saddam is not coming clean. They want more time. Reaction from the White House, U.S. allies in Baghdad. Terror trail. The alleged link between Iraq and al-Qaeda. How strong is the evidence? Fallout. Fear of war drives stocks down again. How war talk is affecting the economy. And a new prescription designed to lower the cost of medicine for seniors, but there is an important trade-off.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. After weeks of weapons inspections, posturing by Iraq, angry demands by the Americans, and skepticism from Western allies,
9/11 politics. The Bush team tries to limit political damage from the 9/11 hearings, while the president says his predecessor has plenty to answer for. And against all odds, 2 Americans, one incredible voyage to conquer the world's longest river.
This is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw. Substituting tonight and reporting from Washington, Brian Williams.
Good evening. This has been a time of high emotion in this capital city, especially for the families of 9/11 victims, here to watch and listen as the government commission looks into what the White House knew about the threat from al-Qaeda and when they knew it under 2 U.S. presidents.
Huntley, David Brinkley, John Chancellor.
More troops. The U.S. to raise troop levels in Iraq by almost 12,000 as violence threatens next month's elections. And Ward 57, home to some of America's bravest soldiers who have to learn how to live all over again.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Tom Brokaw.
Good evening. The American military investment in Iraq is going up from 138,000 troops there now to 150,000. And the Iraqi elections scheduled for January are the big reason.
Ed Huntley.
David Brinkley, John Chancellor.
Tom Brokaw.
Bad intelligence? Is Iran building a bomb? What's North Korea up to? What the U.S. apparently does and does not know after years of trying to find out. And stand-in stand-ups. Jay Leno puts the gag in gag order.
What's Michael Jackson's favorite wine? Come on, your mom won't know.
Why he's letting other comedians do the Michael Jackson jokes these days.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. The American people are constantly being told what a dangerous place the world is right now. In fact, the president and others have gone further, telling us exactly who the bad guys are, the very nations around the world that pose a clear and present danger.
Ed Huntley. David Brinkley, John Chancellor.
Tom Brokaw.
There's a grim new snapshot tonight of the cycle of violence in Iraq, the deadliest month ever with American troops caught in the middle. And from Lebanon to Utah, an emotional rescue for pets caught in the crossfire.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Tomorrow will be the fourth Thanksgiving in harm's way for our troops in uniform in Iraq in this post-9/11 era. Prayer's okay, but drinking is not, at least at the wheel. The new rules of the road for drivers. Wait till you hear where they came from.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Last night, this nation suffered the worst single loss of firefighters since 9/11. It happened in Charleston, South Carolina, at a fire in a furniture store in a strip mall. On our broadcast tonight, trouble in Texas. In the American Southwest tonight, a bad combination. Intense heat and now an intense storm barreling on shore. Perhaps you know the power of a good dog. How about helping kids to read? Also tonight, an update on the condition of the actor Morgan Freeman. Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Tonight, the state of Texas and all the folks in the surrounding region are taking it on the chin in more ways than one. First, they're dealing with history-making heat, dangerous and unhealthy and unrelenting.
On the broadcast tonight, prime time, record numbers of homeowners are in default on their mortgages. And it's not just subprime loans to blame as job losses take their toll. And up in arms, a ban on high school hugs. Why all the fuss about the latest way kids are saying hello? Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Hello, everyone. I'm Lester Holt in tonight for Brian Williams. There is a new face of a home mortgage crisis in this country. Lately, more and more people with good credit.
On our broadcast tonight, free fall. The stock market goes straight down 1,000 points in about 15 minutes tonight. What has happened here? And the revolution, one pill that changed everything for American women. Will there soon be one for men? Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. What happened this afternoon made some people physically ill to watch it. The stock market fell off a cliff, went straight down, a free fall of 1,000 points in just a few minutes. On the broadcast tonight, the disaster in Japan. In the aftermath of the quake and the tsunami, now there's a full-scale nuclear scare, and it's deepening. Tonight, the U.S. is being asked for more help. Our team is on the ground, and our coverage begins now.
Disaster in Japan. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
And a special good evening to our viewers on the West Coast tonight. We have all the latest for you on this disaster in Japan. Most importantly, we have a rather ominous late development tonight. On our broadcast tonight, a rising death toll after that school shooting in Ohio. Tonight, chilling new details from the accused gunman making his first appearance in court. And all the right moves, breaking barriers, inspiring others to follow in her footsteps. Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. The only thing that could have made yesterday's school shooting in Ohio any worse happened today. 2 more students have died of their wounds in that attack. An even more crushing blow for a community 30 miles outside of Cleveland that's absolutely torn apart. On the broadcast tonight from Boston, the toll of the dead and wounded from this city trying to recover from a terrorist bombing. Tonight, we have the latest available information on the investigation so far, including what exploded, the devices themselves, and the cruel design behind them. Also tonight, the deaths of the innocent victims and the stories emerging from a disastrous day. Our special coverage, NBC Nightly News from Boston, begins now.
Terror in Boston. This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, reporting tonight from Boston.
Well, good evening from Boston, just a few blocks from where the explosions rocked the finish line at the Boston Marathon yesterday. On our broadcast tonight, school attack. It has happened again. A student pulls a gun in the cafeteria and opens fire. Tonight, the very latest, including the toll of dead and wounded. And your stories. Tonight, the nominations are in from our viewers, and we'll meet some extraordinary people who are making a difference. Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening, and while we are covering developing news on several fronts on this Friday night, most urgently this evening.
Tonight, getting out alive. Dozens of homes destroyed, thousands more threatened as families in California scramble to escape an unpredictable wildfire now double the size of San Francisco. And in the south, dramatic high water rescues and a historic flood emergency. And what's in the water? 1 year out from the Olympics, a troubling report about what lies beneath in Rio. We're on the water with American athletes. Is it safe? Nightly News begins right now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. Right now, fires are burning from one end of California to the other, the worst of them northwest of Sacramento. Developing news this evening, shockwaves from that explosive confrontation.
Because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
Donald Trump, wounded by the bombshell tape revelation, brings Bill Clinton's accusers to the debate. Tonight, a civil war has ignited in the GOP. Our new poll shows Hillary Clinton surging to a double-digit lead. All Nightly News begins right now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. 29 days until Election Day, and our new poll numbers out tonight speak to the urgent crisis exploding inside the Republican Party from the top down. Tonight, anti-Semitism uproar. President Trump condemns a wave of threats against Jews. What he tells NBC News exclusively after criticism he didn't come at nearly fast enough. Nightly News begins right now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening to our viewers in the West. Against a recent wave of anti-Semitic crimes and threats across the country. Tonight, behind closed doors here in Singapore, we go inside the summit. The nuclear negotiations, the American president praising the North Korean dictator.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. It is the start of a new day here in Singapore and the dawn of a new relationship between the United States and North Korea. Tonight, breaking news. Actress Felicity Huffman will plead guilty in that massive college cheating scandal, along with more than a dozen parents who paid to cheat their kids' way into college. Tonight, her apology, and will she face prison time?
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening, everyone. We got word late today that actress Felicity Huffman and a dozen other parents are admitting guilt in that scheme to buy their children's way into elite universities. Tonight from Houston, a final farewell for George Floyd. The emotional funeral service for the man whose death in police custody has rocked the nation. A celebration of his life, family and friends paying heartfelt tribute. Joe Biden offering condolences, and the horse-drawn carriage taking Floyd to his final resting place beside his mother. The anger over his death living on as protesters once again flood the streets.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. Soaring, emotional, and sometimes tinged with anger. But at its core, the funeral here today for George Floyd was about celebrating a life that will now forever symbolize the fight for equal justice. Tonight, the race to escape Afghanistan, with the country now under total Taliban control. Emergency flights resuming as thousands of Americans and Afghans scramble to get out. The White House in contact with the Taliban, saying they have pledged safe passage. The striking image, over 600 Afghans packed into a U.S. military plane. President Biden under pressure to speed up the evacuation. And new questions. What did U.S. intelligence tell him and when about how fast Afghanistan could fall? Our Richard Engel on the ground. And celebrating one of the world's ultimate puzzle masters.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, the last vestiges of American military might in Afghanistan have restored control of what for many is the only way out. Tonight, the Olympic gymnasts and their powerful testimony on the FBI's failure in the Larry Nassar investigation. Simone Biles and three fellow stars testifying before Congress about the sexual abuse they suffered from the former USA Gymnastics doctor.
I blame Larry Nassar, and I also blame an entire system.
Biles breaking down in tears, accusing the FBI of turning a blind eye. Michaela Maroney saying the FBI betrayed her and allowed abuse to continue. The FBI chief on the hot seat, how he responded, and the countdown to tonight's historic SpaceX launch.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening. We know them from another arena, celebrated gymnasts and Olympians. But today they sat tearfully in front of a different audience in a Senate hearing room.
More Americans watch NBC News than any other news organization in the world.